Hello, Chicago. Well, this is the other side of the spectrum from what you've just heard. I'm going to talk to you about genetically engineered foods and why we deserve to know, why we need to know that they're in our foods. And you may ask, what are they? It's very simple. GE crops, genetically engineered GMOs, are foods that have had their genetic makeup altered to exhibit traits that are not naturally theirs. In other words, to combine genes in a way that could not happen in nature. And so at the Commerce Department, there's no question that these are new foods. The Patent Office has given out hundreds and hundreds of patents because they're absolutely new and unique organisms. Meanwhile, over at the FDA, there is an adopted voluntary guideline that was established back in 1992, 20 years ago, more than that, under the leadership of Dan Quayle when he ran the President's Council on Competitiveness. You might remember Mr. Quayle didn't spell so well. And that policy is one of substantial equivalence. In other words, because these foods look the same, smell the same, taste the same as their non-GE counterparts, they're seen as basically the same. So what you have, in effect, is a schizophrenic federal policy. One agency clearly says they're new, one says they're not. Either way, the cleverness of the Quayle determination and the FDA is adopting that policy is that this allows these products to avoid being categorized as artificial food additives, which must undergo toxicological testing. In fact, nowadays, to get these crops approved, all you need to do is have the patent holder represent that they're safe and they've been tested, and that is it. Unlike drugs, which go through a decade or so of testing, there's no such testing, and I don't think the average consumer knows this. Now, it's interesting to note that around the world, this problem has really been solved. 64 nations around the world, representing over 60% of the world's population, has labeling. In other words, they're allowed to know that their foods contain genetically engineered ingredients if they do. So this means really progressive countries like Russia and China have labeling, give their citizens the rights to know, and yet we don't here in America. There's a lot of questions. Well, why would that be? Why not here in the US, the land of the free? Well, it's clearly explained in this slide right here. These crops are dominant now. Unfortunately, we are not buying and growing all of our foods the way Mario and Stonyfield and others of us, probably all of us, would want to. In fact, the vast majority of GMO foods are right here in the US. And it's an enormously profitable segment because these biotech, so-called biotech companies, the seed companies that sell these seeds also sell the chemicals that are required, whose use increases as a result of having them there. So, just to put this in perspective, 420 million acres, larger than Alaska, is now planted into GE. Nowadays, it's 90% of soy, 89% of corn, and again, several other crops, including sugar beets and others, are growing fast. As you look at the range of crops, you can see that basically this means that most of the processed food that we're eating contains genetically engineered ingredients. It's been a phenomenally successful economic proposition since first introduced in 1996. And there are many, many more coming and many more in the pipeline. Now, because of their dominance in soy and corn, like I say, over 80% of processed foods contain them. I don't, again, think the average consumer knows that. Now, the first question people say is, are they safe? And the answer is, honestly, we don't know. And we're not going to probably know for at least a generation. The literature shows growing concern over the lack of independent testing. There's no third-party analysis of these crops. But the reality is that the government's approval of the crops, like I mentioned, is based solely on the patent holder's representation. And so, while several National Academy of Science studies have affirmed that genetically engineered crops may introduce allergens, may have the potential to introduce new toxins, the reality is we don't know. We may be having large-scale reactions or trends, health trends as a result of these crops, but because we don't know if we're eating them or not, there's no way to actually correlate. So in short, safety is an important question, but it's not the reason that they should be labeled. In fact, if you think about it, virtually all the food and ingredient labels that are out there today have nothing to do with safety. First of all, if an ingredient poses a food safety challenge, we don't ask to put it on the label, we ask to ban it, and we often do. But when the FDA determines that labeling is required for additives like food colorings or dyes or various other byproducts, it's not because they've been found to be unsafe. It's because under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, our law, our protective law, it establishes that consumers have a right to know when something has happened in the process of growing or developing those foods that is not otherwise apparent to us. So, for example, with irradiated foods, you can't really tell the difference by looking or smelling or tasting between an irradiated piece of meat and one that isn't, but labeling is required because in the process of labeling, in the process of irradiating, it's the process itself that's relevant to all of us. And of course, we have the same determination with examples like orange juice from concentrate. I defy you to taste or smell the difference between juice from concentrate versus not. Or wild versus farmed, or country of origin. But in this case, we have a very clearly new food, new genes, new proteins, something that is patented, and again, we believe that we ought to know. And the main reason we ought to know is what I want to get into here. And by the way, it's important to underscore that when asked, 91% of consumers say that they would like to know. In fact, the pollster who reported these results said that 91% of Americans don't agree on anything. So this was a striking result. But let me tell you what specifically concerns me. You will see in the literature and in the test and the political process that endless amounts of testimony by these patent holders was that insecticide and herbicide use would plummet, would drop down because of these new, vivacious, very strong crops. They said that GE farming represents a step towards environmental sustainability by decreasing emissions and so forth. The reality is the exact opposite has happened. The first crop that was introduced back in 1996 had an insecticide actually injected into its DNA, something called bacteriothuringiensis, or BT. And indeed, for the first bunch of years, you saw that there was actually a drop in spraying, not usage of insecticide, but spraying, because of course now the insecticide was in all of our food. But the data is now in that in the years since 2011, in fact, we have not only increased insecticide usage, but we've actually offset all the gains that we had made before. And the reason for that is by overusing an insecticide, one that used to be effective, we are now creating resistant crops. You know, in nature, when bugs and plants are under assault, they don't, like humans, do focus groups to figure out what to do. They just mutate and evolve, and that's exactly what's happened. We now have corn rootworms out there that are no longer adversely affected by a formerly effective pesticide. This problem really becomes real when you look at herbicides. Again, promises that we'll see a reduction in herbicides by the introduction of herbicide-tolerant crops. These are genetically, and by the way, this is the bulk of GE crops. These are crops that actually are bred now to be resistant so that herbicides don't affect them. So you can now spray at will. And in fact, that is what's happened. Over 500 million pounds more glyphosate, Roundup, has been used since the introduction of these crops than would have been used without them. And in fact, the data now, you can see the chart only goes through 2011. The researchers putting together the USDA data on 2012 and 2013 have not published yet. It's being peer reviewed, but they've intimated that that number is probably now over 1 billion pounds. So again, these are crops. In the old days, we used to put a little bit of herbicide down right before we planted, when you put the seeds in the ground so that it would kill off the competition when the little seedlings came up. But now farmers can use these herbicides all year round, all season long, and they in fact do. And the net result of this is that on every single crop that you see with herbicides, and this is, again, endemic across the country, you see these dramatic increases. So much so that 60 to 100% of rainwater now in the Midwest, and here we are, now contains glyphosate. We are literally raining herbicides down. This means we're drinking it, we're eating it, it's in our food, it's in our water, and so forth. Now, I wish that I could tell you, this is the end of the story and it's terrible and all that, but unfortunately, as my favorite philosopher Lily Tomlin says, it got a lot worse before it gets worse. For example, we are told that glyphosate is the benign one, the safe herbicide. It's the one that's safer than all the bad ones it's replaced. Well, a study just came out in April of this year, a meta-analysis looking at 44 papers that showed an absolutely unequivocal correlation between exposure to glyphosate, Roundup, and non-Hodgkin lymphoma. So all of us in this country, because we're all downwind from the Midwest, are now in danger of this. Again, I wish I could tell you this was the end of the story. It gets worse. I'm not truly the most depressing guy you've ever met, and I promise I'll come around to the good stuff in just a moment. But you need to understand that just like with the corn rootworm, as a result of overusing herbicides now, we have superweeds that have sprung up across the country, over 60 million acres. Farmers I've heard testify say that these weeds grow 12 feet tall, they're the diameter of their wrists, and they'll stop a combine in its tracks. In fact, one farmer who was testifying on this said that these superweeds can only be taken down with a chainsaw or a machete. So this is, again, a problem. But in its infinite wisdom, these biotech/chemical companies have come up with a great solution. They've suggested that what farmers should do is introduce a mix of 10% solution of 2,4-D, a stronger herbicide, in with their glyphosate to, again, control these weeds. And surprise, surprise, we are now getting 2,4-D resistant weeds. And by the way, 2,4-D, anybody with my color hair will remember, this is half of what we now know as Agent Orange from the Vietnam days. So, in its infinite wisdom, with resistant weeds, Dow Chemical has now come forward with this one, a new product that's about to be approved by our EPA called the Enlist Duo. This is a combination of 2,4-D and dicamba, two likely carcinogens that are now being introduced along with a seed that's resistant to both. This is what we refer to as the chemical treadmill. We use more herbicides and stronger herbicides, we build resistance, we use stronger. And there are all kinds of problems and issues with this, but the most important is that these are probable carcinogens, and our government is sanctioning their use. Again, I don't think the average consumer or citizen knows that. Now, we're told by Dow, don't worry, this is a newer, kinder 2,4-D. It doesn't drift. In fact, it will only drift 200 feet. And so with the Environmental Working Group, our partners at Just Label It, we went out and analyzed and found indeed, and you can go online at ewg.org and see there's almost 500 elementary schools within 200 feet of a corn or soy field in this country. And by the way, in case they do drift, just in case they're wrong, and they've been wrong before, there's some almost over 3,000 schools within 1,000 feet. This means a soccer ball that flies in there, a child playing in the playground, and we all know kids put their hands in their mouths and so forth. We're playing literally with our kids' futures. Again, the problems are enormous, but they're not disputable. The introduction and proliferation of GE crops has absolutely resulted in an increase in these toxins. As a matter of fact, these toxins, which have thought to be only dangerous to broadleaf plants, are now being shown to adversely impact pollinators like bees and butterflies and monarchs. In fact, they've been shown to kill, in these densities that we're using, because we've never tested at these levels, we're killing off soil microorganisms, resulting in increased compaction, which means that we're having less natural predators and a need for more pesticides. So again, it's a positive feedback loop. Again, I don't think the average consumer knows about this. So this brings me to you and what we can do about this. The organization that I chair is called Just Label It. I urge you, I beg you, please join us at jli.org or justlabelit.org. Here you can join the 1.4 million people who've signed a petition to the FDA saying, do what you're supposed to do. While science works this out and debates the healthfulness and whether this is good or bad for our future, and I think many of us would say that we've already come to that conclusion, it's certainly not sustainable. We deserve the right to know. We deserve the right to see it. We're not asking for a skull and crossbones. We're asking for a couple of words in the ingredients panel, just like orange juice from concentrate. So go to justlabelit.org, where you will see all kinds of activism and ways that you can be personally involved. And it's been effective. This is America's biggest food fight right now. Already just one great success this summer. The Des Moines Register, no less than the heart of corn country, came out with a call for mandatory GE labeling. Why? Because citizens are speaking up. Their readers, their subscribers are saying, yeah, we want the right to know what's in our food. When you go to jli.org, you will see there's all kinds of battles to be fought. For example, there's a positive GE mandatory labeling bill going through, but even more, there's a very dark and dangerous bill, the Pompeo bill going through, which would redefine natural as including GE. I just told you the definition of GE. It combines genes from one species into another in a way that could not happen in nature, and yet apparently in Washington, it can be called natural. And if the Senate swings, as it may very well, this could be a game changer. There are state labeling efforts across the country in 26 different states. You can get actively involved in these states. Ultimately, it needs to be solved at the federal level. And so my request for you today is understand this is not about whether GE is good or not good for you, safe or not safe. We won't know that for a while. It is absolutely about stopping the chemical treadmill, and I invite you and ask you, please, to be involved. Thank you so much.